Good morning. Today is the 11th day of Iyar, the 2nd of May, and we're holding by the third reading of Parshat Emor. And the third reading is mostly about continuing what disqualifies a sacrifice. The same idea that we saw yesterday about what is appropriate to bring into the temple, what people can and can't work in the service. And today we continue with the blemishes of the sacrifices, and then there's a law that's appended to it, which is that you can't slaughter a mother and her child on the same day, animals of course. And then this reading ends with two verses that are considered to be the highlight of this week's Parsha. And I'll just read them to you with the translation's annotated version. He writes like this. We're looking at chapter 22, starting with verse 31. We'll start one verse earlier. It says, "You must safeguard my commandments by studying them thoroughly, and then perform them. I am God who may be relied upon to reward you for complying with my will." Again, I'm reading with the annotated version, so there's a few words in there that don't appear. So now, the next two verses, which are the highlight, I want to read almost in their original translation, and then begin to explain them. "You must not desecrate my holy name, so that I may be sanctified among the Israelites. I am God who sanctifies you, who took you out of Egypt in order that you accept me as your God. I am God." So this is talking about two things: not to desecrate God's name, and the flip side, which is to sanctify God's name. Now, there's a whole discussion about whether these two things are actually two sides of the same coin, or whether they're separate. The way you see this is, there were a number of different sages in the Middle Ages that delineated, that enumerated the 613 commandments. And so there's this question about whether or not to not desecrate God is a separate commandment from to sanctify God. Or are they just two sides of the same coin? If you sanctify, you're not desecrating. If you don't desecrate, then you're sanctifying. And so the big dispute about this is between Rav Saadia Gaon, that we've talked about, and actually his yortzeit is coming up. It's considered to be Yesod of Yesod, which is the foundation. Yesterday was Netzach of Netzach, so we're talking about in 16 days. So maybe we'll say something about Rav Saadia Gaon when we get there. So he ruled that it's really only one or the other, and he brings the not to desecrate God's name. Maimonides, on the other hand, writes that these are two separate commandments. One is not to desecrate His name, and the other is to sanctify. I want to now read it with the additions that Moshe Vishnevsky annotated this with, and it'll give us a better description, because this is considered to be in some ways the most important commandment in the entire Torah, because this is cutting at the core of what the Torah was given for. The Torah was given to sanctify God's name in the world. In other words, to bring the world to acknowledge God. It's true that it also normalizes, it also tells us how to behave on a personal basis and so on. But these two commandments, they're really getting to the core of what the general purpose of the Torah was, and that is to make the world know about God. So the annotated version is like this: "You must not desecrate my holy name, that is, belittle me in the estimation of other Israelites by consenting to disobey my commandments, even under pain of death." In other words, if you're in the presence of other Jews, you cannot willingly disobey a commandment, even if the punishment from whoever is forcing you will be to kill you. If I see fit, he continues, I may rescue you miraculously from martyrdom. And it is true, doing so would enhance my estimation even more than your willingness to die rather than transgress my will. So here there's this concept that if I'm not desecrating God's name, that is one level of sanctification. Because not to desecrate, like we said, can be understood as the flip side of that is to sanctify. Because I'm coming and saying, following God's commandments is more dear to me than life itself. In other words, life without adherence to commandments, for me, is not worth it. I give up. I'm willing to sacrifice it. So that is absolutely sanctification, because it says how dearly I hold this to be something true. Again, this is not that somebody's a suicide bomber. He's not going into somewhere to kill other people. He's saying, I am being forced to transgress a commandment. And I hold the commandment to be more dear than my life. So that's definitely a sanctification. But he says now, if God were to miraculously save me, then that would be an even greater sanctification of his name. In other words, the whole situation of me being in a state where I might have to sacrifice my life is actually a stepping stone. It's a first step in reaching a higher sanctification, which would be God saving me miraculously from being martyred for not willing to transgress a commandment. My estimation, even more than your willingness to die rather than transgress, but you must not offer up your life with any such hope, for doing so taints the sincerity of your devotion, and I will therefore not rescue you if you offer up your life hoping for a miraculous delivery. In other words, it only works if I come and say, I really am willing to sacrifice my life. If I'm expecting to be saved, so that is not an example of higher sanctification. And therefore God says, I won't come to save you if you expect me to. And again, the reasoning is that if I at some level inside feel that I'm willing to, as it were, sacrifice my life because I'm really expecting that God will save me, so my willingness is not true, and I really have not sanctified his name, and therefore he doesn't do me one better by miraculously saving me. Therefore, offer up your life without hope of delivery, so that I may in fact rescue you miraculously, if I see fit, and thereby be sanctified in the onlooker's estimation. This directive is compulsory only when you are among other Israelites, meaning amongst other Jews, in the presence of 10 adult male Jews, not when you are being threatened this way in private. I am God who sanctifies you to be my people at all costs. There is a caveat to that. The three most important prohibitions, the prohibition against serving an idol, idolatry, the prohibition against killing, murder, and the prohibition against improper sexual conduct. These three things, even if a person is in private, the ruling is that he is permitted to sacrifice. He's permitted to be a martyr even if he's in private. However, if he feels that he can't, then he is permitted to transgress them. If it's not being done in public before 10 other Jews. However, still, Maimonides writes that if a person does, God forbid, find himself in such a situation, and he was coerced in private to transgress one of these three main prohibitions, then really his only course for atoning for that is to sanctify God's name for the rest of his life. It's like he was put in a situation where it was not required necessarily, but still to make up for that situation that he was in, and he didn't have the call it the bravery to stand up to his tormentors who forced him to do this. It could have been terrible sin, like for instance, it is a terrible sin still. Maybe idolatry doesn't speak so much to people today, but if I was forced to kill someone, I still have to atone for it, even if I was forced to do it. So this requires, he says, that the rest of his life the person should be struggling and focusing always on sanctifying God's name in some way to make up for it. So this is the highlight, one would say, of the entire parsha. One of the reasons that this is also true is because this verse is one of the few verses in the entire Torah. It's actually in the entire Torah, I think it's the only time that we find holiness mentioned 3 times in the same verse. Again, the translation will be, "You shall not desecrate my holy name, and I will be sanctified, and I am God who sanctifies you." So 3 times sanctifying, 3 times holy. Kodshi v'nikdashti mekadishchem. One last point about this verse. There's a lot to talk about it, and here's the interesting thing. It says that in the future, all the mitzvot will be canceled. All the commandments will be canceled, meaning after the time of the resurrection of the dead, there is no longer a commandment. It doesn't mean that people won't perform the commandments. It just means that there will be no commandment. There won't be any obligation to do so. Everything will be done out of a volunteer spirit, that someone wants to do it. But there's a lot of discussion that this is the only, especially in Chassidut, that this is the only commandment, to sanctify God's name, that will exist even after the resurrection of the dead. Why? Because it is phrased in a very particular way. It says v'nikdashti. V'nikdashti literally means that it's an reflexive verb, meaning it happens by itself. The person cannot have in mind to sanctify God. It has to happen, as it were, by itself from the actions that he's taking. It's like that I can't really reach that level by myself. I can't get to that. I can't get to the point of sanctifying God's name. How could I do that? So it says, it is sanctified by me, meaning the actions that I do, they lead to the sanctification. And therefore, this is not a regular commandment. It's the only commandment that happens, as it were, by itself, by doing other things. So we'll end here today, and God willing, see you again tomorrow.